Everyone thinks the end of Bretton Woods in 1971 was just about gold. Nixon closing the gold window, a technical adjustment to save the dollar. But that's the polite story. The truth is far more human and far more dangerous. It wasn't about gold, it was about power, and about who would control the world's debt once gold could no longer contain it. You've heard the line, the dollar was taken off gold to protect the American economy. But in reality, it was to protect something else, the empire of paper promises that had grown larger than the gold it was built on. By 1971, every major bank and government was swimming in IOUs, dollars that claimed to represent gold but were, in practice, backed only by faith. The arithmetic didn't work anymore. There were $35 printed for every ounce that actually existed in Fort Knox. The trust was overdrawn. Picture it like this: a casino where the chips once stood for real gold coins in the vault. Then the players discovered they could print their own chips, governments, central banks, corporations. The casino kept running, louder than ever, because everyone pretended the gold was still there. Until one night, the biggest player, the United States, simply told the dealer, "No more redemption." That night, August 15, 1971, was the quiet declaration of a new empire, not of gold, but of credit. A world where the value of money would no longer be measured by metal, but by confidence. Confidence managed, manipulated, and enforced by a small network of central banks and financial institutions. They said it was temporary. It became permanent. They said it would stabilize prices. It unleashed the most violent inflation cycles in modern history. They said it would make trade freer. It made debt universal. Half a century later, we stand on the edge of another reset, not in 1971, but in 2026. Another moment where the math no longer fits the promise, where the debts are too big and the trust too thin. The old game is ending again. The only question is, who controls the table this time? To understand why the world's money broke in 1971, we need to go back to the moment it was built, to a small mountain resort in New Hampshire, July 1944. The war wasn't even over yet. Europe was still burning, Asia was in ruins, but 730 delegates from 44 allied nations gathered in a hotel called Mount Washington. Their mission sounded noble, to rebuild the world's economy after the destruction of war. In truth, they were deciding who would own the post-war world, not through armies, but through credit. The plan was sold as cooperation, but it was in fact consolidation. Britain came in exhausted, France was bankrupt, and most of Europe owed Washington money for weapons and supplies. The United States alone held 2/3 of the world's gold and more than half of its industrial capacity. Bretton Woods was less a negotiation than a coronation. The dollar became the center of a new monetary order, but disguised as a global consensus. The key mechanism was simple, almost elegant. Every currency would be tied to the US dollar, and the dollar itself would be tied to gold at $35 per ounce. In theory, anyone could redeem dollars for real metal. In practice, only governments and central banks could. For ordinary citizens, gold ownership had been banned inside the US since 1933. The people's gold had quietly become the state's gold. At the heart of this system stood two new institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Their names sounded philanthropic, but their function was to manage debt and discipline. The IMF became the global lender of last resort, deciding which countries were sound enough to borrow and which needed austerity. The World Bank financed reconstruction on the condition that it used American contractors, American steel, American dollars. It was a brilliant design, not of freedom, but of dependency. Every nation now needed dollars to trade, to import oil, to pay debts. And since only Washington could issue them, the US gained the privilege of printing the world's reserve currency, a right the French later called le privilège exorbitant. The man who designed much of this framework, Harry Dexter White, an American Treasury official, understood that control of global liquidity meant control of global policy. His British counterpart, John Maynard Keynes, fought for a more balanced system, a neutral world currency called the Bancor. But Keynes lost. Britain had no leverage. The empire of trade was giving way to the empire of debt, and the dollar would be its crown. From 1944 onward, every barrel of oil, every ton of copper, every ship of wheat was priced in dollars. That wasn't economics, it was strategy. The world now needed to hold U.S. Treasury bills as reserves, meaning America could finance itself by exporting paper. Real goods flowed out, paper promises flowed in. As long as the rest of the world believed in those promises, the system worked. But there was a flaw built into its DNA. For the system to grow, America had to run deficits. More dollars had to leave the U.S. than come back, or the world wouldn't have enough liquidity to trade. That meant gold coverage, the promise of redemption, would always weaken over time. In 1949, a few analysts already warned, either the world runs out of gold or it runs out of faith. Through the 1950s and 60s, faith won, temporarily. Europe rebuilt, Japan industrialized, and dollars flooded across the planet. It felt like prosperity, but it was also imbalance disguised as progress. The French economist Jacques Rueff called it a deficit without tears. America could spend endlessly abroad, pay with its own currency, and never face the pain of adjustment other nations suffered. Behind the scenes, central banks began to notice the arithmetic gap widening. By the mid-1960s, foreign claims on U.S. gold exceeded the gold itself. The system was mathematically impossible to maintain, but politically impossible to admit. To confess it would mean telling the world that money was just trust. That's when the real story begins. The secret meetings, the London gold pool, and the quiet wars of redemption between allies who no longer trusted each other's paper. Bretton Woods was a system of order built on a paradox, stability that depended on infinite expansion. It was beautiful, logical, and doomed. For nearly 20 years after the war, Bretton Woods looked like perfection. The newspapers called it the golden age of capitalism. In Europe, factories roared back to life. In Japan, skyscrapers began to rise over the ashes. The American dream became the world's export: highways, refrigerators, Coca-Cola, and credit. Everyone believed the system worked because everyone was making money. But illusions are always most convincing at their peak. Think of the 1950s and 60s as a global theater of prosperity. The stage lights were bright, but backstage the props were borrowed. The U.S. printed dollars to fund wars in Korea and Vietnam, to build suburbs, to lend abroad. Each new note promised the same gold that still sat, unmoving, in Fort Knox. The more the world prospered, the more dollars it demanded, and so the illusion grew: debt as wealth, paper as trust, confidence as collateral. At the time, this seemed like genius. Why hoard metal when you can print influence? Washington discovered it could finance both guns and butter, a war overseas and social programs at home, simply by issuing more promises. As long as other countries accepted those dollars as good as gold, the magic continued. It was a trick that even magicians would admire. Spend what you don't have, then make everyone else believe they hold something real. Europe and Japan were in on the performance too. The Marshall Plan had rebuilt their industries, but it had also tied their currencies to the dollar. They sold goods to America, earned dollars, then recycled those dollars back into U.S. Treasury bonds, lending the money back to the very country that spent it. The circle was complete. The world's trade surplus became America's deficit, and America's deficit became the world's money supply. Meanwhile, television commercials sold a new faith: consumption. You didn't have to save gold anymore. You could borrow the future. Credit cards, mortgages, and installment plans turned delayed gratification into instant comfort. Buy now, pay later became the spiritual slogan of the age. Nations did the same, borrowing dollars to industrialize, convinced they were entering the modern world. Few noticed that this modernity was built on a silent pyramid: real value at the bottom, layers of paper on top. By the mid-1960s, the illusion had reached its most seductive moment. Inflation was low, unemployment was low, growth was high. Economists claimed they had solved the cycle of booms and busts. President Lyndon Johnson declared a great society. In Paris, students marched for ideals. In Saigon, bombs fell for geopolitics. Both were funded by the same printing press. But beneath the optimism, cracks widened. Gold was leaving the United States faster than it could be replaced. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began demanding real metal for its dollars, sending ships to New York to collect bullion. Germany and Switzerland followed quietly. The London Gold Pool, a secret alliance of 8 central banks formed in 1961 to keep the gold price fixed, was melting under the weight of reality. Imagine that, a handful of men in suits, meeting in private rooms in London, deciding every morning how much gold to sell from their reserves to defend an artificial price. It worked for a while, until speculators realized the pool was finite. In 1968, the gold market exploded. Demand overwhelmed supply, the pool collapsed, and the system's guardians ran out of tricks. Still, the show continued. Politicians reassured the public. The dollar is as good as gold, they said, even as they quietly prepared for the moment it wouldn't be. The illusion had lasted nearly a generation. It had created wealth, comfort, and confidence. But it also created something else, the belief that growth could be infinite, that deficits didn't matter, and that trust could replace substance forever. Every empire reaches this phase. Rome with its debased silver denarius, France with its assignat, Britain with its paper pounds. Prosperity turns into entitlement, and entitlement into denial. The numbers grow faster than the metal, faster than production, faster than truth. If you're listening to this in 2025, the pattern should sound familiar. The tools have changed. Bonds instead of gold, digital credits instead of paper. But the mechanism is the same. Expansion without anchor, confidence without backing. Every illusion meets its reckoning. For Bretton Woods, it came not with a crash, but with a press conference. A Sunday night, August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon looked into the camera and announced what he called temporary measures. He said it calmly, almost casually. The United States would no longer redeem dollars for gold. Simple words, but they detonated the foundation of the world economy. To the public, it sounded like a technical move. To those who understood the code, it was a confession. The U.S. was bankrupt in gold terms. There were claims for over $50 billion worth of gold abroad, and only about $10 billion left in the vault. The arithmetic had spoken, louder than diplomacy. It's worth remembering how desperate that summer was. Inflation was rising. The Vietnam War drained resources. The U.S. was losing its trade surplus for the first time in decades. Foreign central banks, led by France and Switzerland, were lining up to convert their dollar holdings into bullion. In just 3 months, over 1,000 tons of gold had left the U.S. Treasury. The line of redemption was turning into a run on the bank. So Nixon did what all governments eventually do when reality catches up. He changed the rules. He declared the gold window closed, froze wages and prices, and blamed speculators for the crisis. The irony was that the speculators were the very allies who had once believed in America's promises. From that moment, money lost its anchor. The dollar became what economists politely call fiat currency, money by decree. Its value rested not on metal, but on trust in government. The gold standard had been the last link between words and weight, between finance and physics. When it snapped, something deeper broke, the illusion that currencies were objective measures of value. The following years were chaos disguised as innovation. Currencies floated, prices surged, and oil-producing nations realized their power. By 1973, the dollar had lost 30% of its value against gold. The world entered the age of volatility, an opportunity for those who understood it. Behind the curtain, new deals were struck. In 1974, Washington and Riyadh sealed the petrodollar arrangement. Saudi oil would be sold only in dollars, and the excess profits, the oil surpluses, would be recycled into U.S. Treasury bonds. It was genius. The world still needed dollars, but now for oil instead of gold. One anchor replaced by another. Instead of a metal, it was energy that tied the world to America's currency. But the shift came with a cost. Inflation in the 1970s destroyed savings and faith alike. Families watched prices triple. Developing countries, drowning in dollar-denominated debt, saw their currencies collapse. The very mechanism that had promised stability became a machine for exporting crisis. By the early 1980s, the U.S. Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, raised interest rates to nearly 20% to stop runaway inflation. It worked, by breaking the back of the global debt pyramid. Latin America plunged into a lost decade. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and the dollar emerged stronger, not because it was virtuous, but because everyone else was weaker. The system had reset itself through pain. This was the hidden law of the new order: expansion through credit, correction through crisis. Each wave of inflation, each crash, each debt spiral, not a failure, but a mechanism of control. The creditor always survives, the debtor always adjusts. Bretton Woods hadn't ended, it had evolved into something even more abstract, a world where money could be created at will, debt could be rolled forever, and power flowed not from gold, but from the ability to issue infinite promises. And every reset since, from 1987's crash, to 1998's LTCM bailout, to 2008's global crisis, to 2020's pandemic printing, follows the same script: a cycle of trust, expansion, panic, and rescue. The mathematics never disappeared. It only hid behind the language of liquidity, stimulus, and quantitative easing. Look closely. The collapse of 1971 wasn't the end of something old. It was the birth of the world we live in now, a world where money is no longer a measure, but a weapon, where debt is not a problem, but a product, and where faith, once broken, must be constantly managed. If you're hearing this and thinking of your mortgage, your currency, your savings, you're not imagining the connection. It began that night in 1971, when arithmetic finally broke politics, and politics rewrote the meaning of value. If this opened your eyes to what the Nixon shock really was, drop a comment, because history didn't end there. It only went off the gold standard. After 1971, the world didn't collapse, it expanded. That was the brilliance of the new order. By removing the anchor, the ship could sail anywhere, faster than ever. Debt became the wind in its sails. From Wall Street to Tokyo, from London to Sao Paulo, finance took command over industry. Money, no longer limited by metal, became pure imagination, numbers in ledgers, zeros on screens. And with that imagination came empire. The 1980s brought the Reagan-Thatcher era, the age of deregulation and markets set free. But freedom for whom? For capital. Banks discovered that under the new system, risk could be repackaged, sold, and insured. A loan wasn't a promise anymore. It was an asset to trade. Derivatives, futures, and swaps became the new instruments of control. And like every empire before, it had its priests, the central bankers, whose words could move continents. The dollar, far from weakening, became stronger than ever. Not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by debt. And everyone needed that debt. Oil exporters invested their surpluses in U.S. bonds. Developing nations borrowed those same dollars to pay for imports. When they defaulted, the IMF stepped in, not to forgive, but to restructure. Stability programs cut social spending, privatized resources, and ensured that the flow of payments never stopped. By the 1990s, globalization had turned this system into a single circuit. Factories moved east, profits flowed west, and credit linked them all. The fall of the Soviet Union didn't just end a political rivalry, it opened a new financial frontier. Capitalism had no counterweight left. Bretton Woods had died in 1971, but its ghost, the idea of a single global reserve currency, ruled unchallenged. Then came 2008. A generation raised in prosperity watched the system crack again. The same trick repeated: too much debt, too much leverage, too much faith in models that assumed infinite liquidity. When the bubble burst, the Federal Reserve did what Nixon had done decades earlier. It changed the rules. Instead of closing the gold window, it opened the digital one, creating trillions of dollars with keystrokes. The new gold was confidence in policy. The new vault was a spreadsheet. It worked temporarily. Markets recovered, but inequality exploded. The top 1% gained more wealth in a decade than most nations earn in a century. Meanwhile, savers, retirees, and wage earners discovered the quiet tax of the fiat age: inflation. Not always in prices, but in assets, homes, stocks, education. The cost of living rose, but the cost of money collapsed. By the 2020s, the illusion of endless credit had reached its digital form. Central banks issued stimulus during the pandemic, governments spent like wartime, and global debt crossed $300 trillion. For the first time in history, the entire planet owed more than it could ever produce. Arithmetic, once again, began to whisper its verdict. But this time, the stage looks different. New players, China, India, the BRICS alliance, are building alternatives. Gold-backed settlement systems, digital currencies, trade networks outside the dollar. They call it de-dollarization, but it's really the same process that France triggered in 1968, now on a planetary scale. Too many claims, too little trust. And somewhere in those negotiations, quietly, behind press releases and digital pilots, the outline of a new reset is forming. 2026 is whispered as a possible inflection point, the moment when central bank digital currencies, new reserve baskets, and energy-backed tokens could replace the current structure. A currency realignment, they call it. But every reset carries the same logic, to preserve control when the numbers stop adding up. The rhetoric will sound familiar: modernization, inclusion, efficiency. But look past the slogans. Just as 1944 tied the world to the dollar through gold, and 1971 tied it to oil through the petrodollar, the coming system will tie it to code, programmable, traceable, centrally issued. Money will no longer just measure your work, it will define your permission. That's why understanding Bretton Woods isn't nostalgia, it's prophecy. The same forces, debt, trust, and control, are preparing their next transformation. And once again, the official story will say it's to protect stability. In reality, it's to preserve dominance when mathematics demands change. Every currency system begins with faith and ends with arithmetic. That is the silent law behind every empire, from Rome's silver denarius to the dollar's digital twin. What begins as a promise, this note represents value, slowly becomes a confession. This note is the value. And once that line blurs, collapse is only a matter of timing. Look at the pattern. Gold once anchored kings. Paper once anchored nations. Now algorithms anchor belief. But belief still serves the same masters, those who control issuance, credit, and the definition of stability. The words change: Bretton Woods, quantitative easing, digital currency realignment. Yet the structure remains. Few create money, many chase it. The danger isn't that money will vanish. It's that it will become perfect, perfectly traceable, programmable, conditional. A system where your access to value depends on compliance, where the ledger replaces the conscience. The next reset won't be announced with a presidential speech. It will arrive as an app update, a new digital wallet, a promise of convenience hiding the oldest trait of all: freedom for security, trust for control. If you listen closely, you can already hear the tone of 1971 echoing again. Polite words about temporary measures, modernization, and financial innovation. Yet the truth remains what it always was. Systems don't collapse because of bad intentions. They collapse when the numbers outgrow the trust that sustains them. So when they speak of a new Bretton Woods moment or a 2026 currency alignment, remember this: resets are not about balance, they're about ownership. The winners are always those who understand before the announcement, those who see the pattern, not the propaganda. Arithmetic cannot be deceived. When faith exceeds substance, when promises multiply faster than production, the reset becomes inevitable. The only choice we have is whether we enter it blind or awake.